Now we're going to talk about transformations, which are moving objects or rotating them or scaling them in the 3D world. So let's say that I have a box here, and before I do anything, I'm going to select my move tool. One way to select it is to go up here and select it, or right click and choose move. This is what I use most of the times. Another way to select the move tool is to press W on the keyboard. If you select Q on the keyboard, you're gonna go to the select tool. W is move, E is rotate, and then R is scale. So once I am in my move tool, I have this so-called transform gizmo that I can use to move my object. First, I have the gizmo with 3 axes, X, Y, and Z. I'll see that X is colored red, Y is colored green, and Z is colored blue. Whenever I roll over one of the axes, it turns yellow, meaning that it's the active axis. So if I place my cursor over the X axis, I can move the object only in the X direction. If I place my cursor over the Y axis, I can only move in the Y direction. And the same goes for the Z axis. Now if I want to move my object in a plane, say the XY plane, I would click here, and now I can move my object on the horizontal XY plane. If I click there, I'm now moving my object in the vertical ZY plane, and the same goes for the ZX plane. Now this is moving the objects in a visual manner. In case I want to precisely move my objects, all I have to do is type in the coordinates down here. So in case I wanted to return my object to the center of the grid, which is 0, 0, 0 for X, Y, and Z, all I have to do is type 0 for X, 0 for Y, and 0 for Z. And now the center of the object, which is called the pivot point, is returned back to the center of the grid. So let's say that I want to move my object 1 meter high. The vertical direction is the Z axis, therefore I'm going to type Z is equal to 100 for 100 centimeters, and there my object is moved up by 1 meter. If I reset this back to 0, I'm going to take it back to the origin. Now for rotation, I'm going to click on rotate, and here I'm also presented with 3 rotation axes. The red stands for X, because if you go down here you can see that red is X, Y is green, and blue is Z. So this is rotating around the X axis, this is rotating around the Y axis, and this is rotating around the Z axis. So if you have, for example, say a few boxes and you want to rotate them in the horizontal plane, it means that you want to rotate them around their Z axis. So you'd select all 4 of them, for example. You can also select this one here, and now all of them are rotating around the Z axis, because the Z axis is the vertical axis, and the rotation is going to happen in the perpendicular plane, which is the way it's happening right now. This is rotating around the Y axis, and this is around the X axis. Now here you would notice that all the objects are rotating around the center of the selection. So if I just had these selected, the center of the selection would be down here, and therefore my objects are rotating around the center of the selection. If I rotate from the middle of the sphere anywhere, I'd be rotating in free form, but it's preferable that you rotate around one axis at a time, because when I rotate free form, I'm going to see that down here I have all 3 axes changing, so it's a bit hard to control the rotation values. So it's best to rotate around one axis at a time. So again, this is rotating all the objects around their selection center. In case I wanted to rotate the objects each around its own center, which is called the pivot point, all I have to do is go up here and choose use pivot point center. So now each object will rotate around its own pivot point. Okay, I'm gonna delete my objects here. The next thing I'll talk about is scaling. So if I choose scale, I have the scale transform gizmo, which has a triangle in the center, and then it has three sides to that triangle, and then it has axes. The first thing I can do is scale my object proportionately by scaling from the center, which is the recommended thing to do in case you have to scale your object. Another thing I can do is scale in a plane. So for example, if I want to scale in the XY plane, I would go like this. That would scale the object but keep the Z direction constant. If I scale in the YZ plane, I'm going to keep the X dimension constant. And the same goes for the XZ plane, and that would keep the Y dimension constant because X and Z are changing but Y is still static. If I want to scale in one axis only, I would go like this, and that would scale in the selected axis. You should note though that the scaling procedure, especially non-uniform scaling, is very bad in case you wanted to animate your object later. So in case your object was targeted for animation, you should just scale in the XYZ uniform scale, because if you do scale in any other dimension, the animation will be messed up later on. So make sure that you don't use non-uniform scaling in case you wanted to animate your object later on, but just use uniform scaling, which is scaling from the center. Alright, that's it for transformations. Next, we're going to talk about modifying our created objects.